topic was suggested by the fact that we're approaching the 50th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. These last few years, the last years of the 1990s, are a sort of a season of semi-centennial anniversaries. The reason's obvious. World War II marked a very significant turning point in human affairs. The industrial societies were mostly destroyed. The U.S. economy prospered during the war. The U.S. ended the war in a position of extraordinary power. It had about half the wealth of the world, incomparable military power and security, and naturally it used this power to attempt to organize the world, to construct a new world order, which in fact really deserved the term. It's now half a century. We can look back and ask how it's fared. The New World Order of the late 40s was based on three fundamental building blocks. One was an international economic order, what's called the Bretton Woods system. A second was an international political order, of which the foundation is the United Nations Charter. And the third was a set of international norms for the behavior of governments toward their populations. That's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So what I want to do is review where these stand, what's happened to them, what it suggests for the future, and I'll focus primarily on the third, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Well, the Bretton Woods system is often described as a system of liberal internationalism. Actually, I've described it that way, but that's not quite correct. The intent of the founders of Bretton Woods, Harry Dexter White, the U.S. negotiator, and John Maynard Keynes, the British negotiator, their intent was partially to create an international liberal order. They intended to try to liberalize trade, but at the same time to regulate capital. Those two principles were related, and they're in fact reflected in the rules of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. Those rules state that the charter of the IMF states that countries are entitled to regulate capital, and the IMF is in fact prohibited by its charter from providing credit, what are called rescue packages these days, to cover capital flight. That's prohibited. The reason for the regulation of capital flow was in part a belief widely held among economists, including Keynes and White, that liberalization of capital, allowing free flow of capital, would undermine free trade. That's a thesis. Like most laws of economics, it's largely speculative, but plausible, and in fact rather well supported by the experience of the last 25 years. I'll come back to that. But the major reason was something which wasn't a thesis, it was a virtual truism, and that is that free movement of capital undermines democracy and essentially dismantles the welfare state, which was very popular, had an enormous amount of support among the public and throughout the world, including the United States. So that couldn't be simply abandoned. In fact, they wanted to strengthen it. The problem is that free flow of capital creates what some international economists call a virtual Senate, meaning financial capital can impose the social policies that it chooses on governments, and it can punish those that deviate by capital flight. That naturally restricts democracy. It undermines the possibility for governments, meaning to the extent that they're democratic people, to participate in socioeconomic planning. And it also undermines efforts to use public resources what's called inefficiently. That means for people, not for investors. So, for example, efforts to stimulate the economy or to create full employment or to use public resources for health or education or for social welfare, for the environment, for improved working conditions, and other irrational purposes can be terminated and punished by simply flight of capital, which even these days rich and powerful states can't withstand. That's the main reason for the insistence in the Bretton Woods system that capital flight be regulated and controlled, and the prohibition on the IMF to provide credits to cover capital flight. Well, those principles, the second principle, the prohibition on credits for capital flight, that was never taken seriously. The rescue packages, as they're called for the third world, quite substantially do cover capital flight. The third world debt would be very close to eliminated, in some cases completely eliminated, if the societies were able to control their own wealthy people, meaning keep the capital at home and keep the wealthy from robbing the country. In the case of Indonesia, for example, the current IMF rescue package is approximately equal to the estimated wealth of the Suharto family. So there's an easy way to pay off the debt. Just go to the people who've been robbing the country blind ever since they took power in a huge massacre 30 years ago. The Latin American debt, capital flight from wealthy Latin Americans comes pretty close, and sometimes, in fact, exceeds the third world debt, the Latin American debt, which was such a catastrophe since 1982. The way things work, the money is borrowed by the wealthy and by dictators and generals and so on, and then it's paid by the poor. They pay it off, and by Western taxpayers when the debt is socialized. But those aren't economic laws, those are social constructions. And they reflect the failure to take seriously this founding principle of the New World Order. It isn't, incidentally, just the Third World. That began back in the late 1940s with the reconstruction of Europe. There was money in Europe in the hands of wealthy Europeans, but U.S. planners preferred to have wealthy Europeans send their wealth to New York banks with American taxpayers paying for the reconstruction of Europe. There's actually a name for that. It's called the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan, if you look at the figures, and this was well understood at the time, the Marshall Plan funding is approximately the same order and may even have been exceeded by flight of capital from wealthy Europeans to New York banks. So that principle was words. It's never been applied. On the other hand, the other principle about constraining capital flow, that was taken quite seriously. That principle was enforced during what's usually called the golden age of post-war economic growth, high economic growth, high productivity growth, expansion of the social contract, the period of the 1950s and 60s. That was a period in which, in fact, capital was closely regulated. That system, the Bretton Woods system, was broken down and dismantled by Richard Nixon in the early 1970s with the assistance of Britain and later other countries. And it had pretty much the predicted effects. It was predicted right away in the early 70s when capital controls were dismantled that this would lead to a period of low growth, low wages, and in fact very high profits, which is pretty much what we've seen. There was also an attack on the welfare state, primarily in the United States and Britain, but to an extent in other rich countries as well. These are major features of the past 25 years, also lower productivity growth and indeed lower growth of trade, because as the thesis suggested, the elimination of capital controls introduced various forms of protectionism, pretty much as predicted. So this has been a period of what's been called a sustained assault on free trade by the head of economic research at the World Trade Organization in a major technical study. He incidentally estimates Reaganite barriers to imports as having about 3 times the effect of other trade barriers instituted by other rich countries. And in fact, the Reagan administration broke new records in market interference in this and other ways. Has been a period of very high concentration of the sum wealth that has been produced, and it's been very highly concentrated. As you all know, inequality has risen very sharply, primarily in the United States and Britain. In the US, it's back to the levels of the 1920s. We're currently in the midst of something called a fairy tale economic boom. It is a fairy tale. It's the weakest recovery in post-war history, far below the 50s and the 60s, and not even at the level of the rather anemic 70s and 80s. In fact, U.S. economic growth in the 1990s is roughly about at the norm for the rich countries, the OECD countries. The economic boom, the fairy tale economic boom, is unique in another respect. It's the first one in American history where there has been no increase in median income for about 2/3 of the population. Wages and incomes have either stagnated or even significantly declined in the last 20, 25 years. And while they're rising slightly now, it's not even back to the 1989 level, let alone the 1970s. People are working longer. The average worker is working about a month longer than 25 years ago. Working conditions are much worse. There's less pay. There's far less security. But there is enormous wealth, very highly concentrated. All the odes to the fairy tale economic boom quite consistently point to the stock market as a proof of how great things are. And it is great for the people who own stock. 1% of the population of households owns about half the stock, and most of the rest is owned by the top 10%. If you bring in pension funds, you get a little shuffling in the top 20%, but for most of the population, roughly 3/4, this is just something you watch, not something you take part in, and you watch it while your own conditions stagnate or decline. That's the fairy tale economic boom. It's understood why the boom is taking place. It was explained in this fashion. It was actually explained by the man who the business press calls the saintly Alan Greenspan. In his, I didn't make it up, it's the Financial Times of London, the leading business paper in the world. The saintly Alan testified about the fairy tale economic boom before Congress about a year ago, and he took great pride in it. He's head of the Federal Reserve. He attributed the fairy tale to what he called greater worker insecurity. In other words, workers are too intimidated to ask for benefits or wages or better working conditions, and that contributes to something called the health of the economy. That's a technical term. It's uncorrelated with the health of the population, often contrary to it. But greater worker insecurity does contribute to that. The Clinton administration, in the economic report of the president last year, the last one, they also took pride in the great economic achievements, and they basically gave the same explanation. They attributed them to what they called significant wage restraint. Well, yeah, that's the result of growing worker insecurity. Workers are frightened, and with cause. So, for example, one of the consequences of NAFTA, which was studied under NAFTA, as you recall, it's basically an investor rights agreement, but it did have some wording thrown in to make it look as if labor rights and environmental rights were going to be considered. Under those side agreement, there is a requirement that complaints about unfair labor practices must be investigated. And in the course of one of these investigations, a study was done by a well-known U.S. labor economist, Kate Bronfenbrenner of Cornell University, studying the effects of NAFTA on organizing efforts in the United States. Her report was in fact released by Canada and Mexico. It was delayed by the Clinton administration. She discovered that in fully half of the organizing efforts since NAFTA have been disrupted by threats to transfer production to Mexico. For example, like a trailer can be put up outside a plant with a sign on it saying Mexico transfer job or something like that. That's all illegal, but the Reagan administration and now the Clinton administration have basically informed the business community that they're not going to apply the laws. So it may be illegal, but it happens. And those threats are not idle. After NAFTA, when organizing efforts nevertheless succeed, the rate of actual transfer is 3 times the level prior to NAFTA. These are reasons why workers are intimidated, and there are plenty of others. So during this period of dazzling profit growth in the fairy tale economic boom, major corporations have made plenty of money. In fact, they don't know what to do with it. Some of them do know what to do with it. For example, the Caterpillar Corporation just won a major strike, a big blow to labor in Illinois. One of the techniques that they used was to make use of excess production facilities that they had created abroad, not for purposes of economic efficiency, but for class warfare. They could use their excess capacity, production capacity abroad, to undermine domestic workers, which they did, along with other measures such as the use of permanent replacement workers in violation of international conventions. The United States has been censured for that by the International Labor Organization, but of course doesn't care. These are contributory factors to greater worker intimidation, and they're related to the lack of constraints on capital flow. In the third world, it ends up with miserable poverty and structural adjustment programs and so on. Here, it leads to a fairy tale economic boom based on growing worker insecurity. Well, that's the international economic system in a very quick nutshell. What about the international political system based on the UN Charter? That one we can go through we can be brief. The fundamental principle of the United Nations Charter is a flat prohibition against the threat or use of force in international affairs. Sole exception is either self-defense if somebody attacks you until the Security Council acts, or else when authorized by the Security Council. Well, we've just been through a dramatic illustration of the status of this principle, namely the Iraq crisis. There was a good deal of discussion of what measures the United States should take. Should it do this? Should it do that? Should it do the other thing? But I couldn't find any discussion at all of the idea that maybe we should live up to what is technically the supreme law of the land under the Constitution, namely the United Nations Charter, which bars the United States from doing anything except on the specific authorization of the Security Council. That wasn't even an option. So that's not considered. In fact, if you read Secretary of State Albright's statements and others, President Clinton and the rest, they simply said, we will act as we determine appropriate in judgment of our so-called national interest. If we decide that we will use force or threaten force, nobody's going to change that because we regard ourselves as a rogue state, which is free from any international obligations, and certainly any conditions imposed by the UN Charter. Well, that's dead. The Charter's words. Thanks to the actions of the most powerful states, and there's nothing new about this. More than 10 years ago, back in 1986, the United States even went so far as to veto a Security Council resolution which called on all states to observe international law, mentioning no one in particular, but everyone knew who they meant. It was an oblique reference to the fact that the World Court had just determined that the United States was guilty of what the court called unlawful use of force, a polite way of referring to aggression in its terrorist war against Nicaragua. And of course, the U.S. rejected the judgment of the court with complete contempt, as did intellectual opinion. But then it went to the Security Council, where the U.S. vetoed a resolution calling on states to observe international law, and it then proceeded to veto several General Assembly resolutions with the same. You can't technically veto the General Assembly resolution, but when the U.S. votes against it, if the vote is, let's say, 150 to 1, as it often is, the resolution is essentially vetoed. So this is old. The international political system is basically weapons that you can use against the weak. Well, let's turn to the third pillar of the New World Order, the Universal Declaration. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is based on the principle, the fundamental principle of it is given in the phrase universal. The provisions of the Universal Declaration are to have equal standing. That is, there are no grounds for what is called relativism, self-serving relativism, a decision to selectively adopt one or another of the provisions. And there certainly are no grounds for the particularly ugly form of selective relativism, which involves appeal to the Universal Declaration as a weapon against enemies. There was a vast amount of discussion about this just about 5 years ago. There was a conference at Vienna in 1993 on the Universal Declaration. You look back at the press, many of you will remember there was a deluge of impressive rhetoric which was praising Washington's courage in standing up against, in upholding the universality of the Universal Declaration against what were called third world relativists, people who appeal to Asian values or other deviations from the sacred principles. Well, those are good principles, maybe even noble principles, and we can ask how well they have fared over the years, concentrating on the most important case, the most powerful state, the self-appointed guardian of global virtue, and defender of the universality of the Universal Declaration. And apart from those objective factors, the state that's, of course, most important for us, for the obvious reason that we share responsibility for what it does, either by lending support or by tacit acquiescence. Well, you look at the Universal Declaration, you find that its provisions fall into two major categories. The first is what are called civil and political rights. The second, what are called socioeconomic rights. Let's start with the civil and political rights. The UD, the Universal Declaration, is not very well known in the United States. So you can ask your friends to list the resolutions and you probably won't get very good answers. But there is one article which is very well known. The most famous of all, that's Article 13. It says, everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own. The reason why that is very well known is that every year on Human Rights Day, December 10th, there were huge demonstrations and big advertisements and so on denouncing the Soviet Union correctly for rejecting Article 13 and not allowing Soviet Jews to leave. So that's Article 13. Actually, that's part of Article 13. Actually, what Article 13 says is something a little different, and I have never seen the final words quoted in all of this, in all of this massive publicity. What Article 13 says is everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own, and return to his own country. Well, those final words are omitted. Their meaning was spelled out on December 11th, 1948, the day after the acceptance of the Universal Declaration in UN Resolution 194, which was unanimously accepted as well, and which stated that Palestinian refugees who had fled or been expelled from their homes had the right of return, or if they chose not to return, of compensation. The compensation would have been no small matter. The government of Israel secretly, it's now released in secret documents, estimated the compensation costs at that time at about $1 billion, which would be roughly $6 billion today, not counting interest, far greater than German reparations. Well, that's Resolution 194, that's Article 13. Half of it states that anyone, and specifically Palestinians, they were the ones they were talking about, have the right to return to their own country. Well, that's the history of this is kind of interesting. If you think it through, you'll notice that the most passionate and vocal defenders of Article 13 were, and the ones who were most angrily denouncing the Soviet Union for rejecting it, are in fact the strongest opponents of Article 13. They would never have considered for a moment permitting Article 13 to apply. Article 13, Resolution 194 calling for the right of Palestinians to return, that was voted, as I mentioned, unanimously, and again every year. Year after year it was endorsed, completely hypocritically, of course, no one really meant it. But notice that this is a case of really extreme relativism. We take an article of the Universal Declaration and decide that the last 5 words of it don't exist, the ones that apply in a fashion which the powerful, in this case the United States and its clients, do not accept. That's relativism pushed to an extreme, apart from the hypocrisy. To the credit of the Clinton administration, they did end the hypocrisy. In 1993, for the first time, the United States voted against Resolution 194, along with Israel. That rescinds the second half of Article 13. The first half is now irrelevant with the Soviet Union gone, so there's no more hypocrisy. Article 13 is simply removed from the Universal Declaration by U.S. fiat. As for the refugees, the millions of refugees, they have been disappeared, to borrow a term of our Latin American clients. The so-called peace process doesn't even mention them, offers them nothing. Well, that's Article 13. It's relativism triumphant. Let's move on to Article 14. Article 14 says that everyone has the right to seek and enjoy asylum from persecution. Haitians, for example. Right in the middle of the Vienna Conference, in fact, just as it opened, 87 more Haitians were captured by Clinton's illegal blockade of the island and forcibly returned to their torture chamber. There was a terrorist military regime at the time which was carrying out brutal murders and assassinations. This event was virtually unmentioned in the press, in the national press, unmentioned in the Boston Globe. It did make page 68, was mentioned in a story on another topic. So that's everyone having the right to seek and enjoy asylum from persecution. The Clinton administration, of course, didn't invent this. This policy of forcibly returning Haitians to terror and oppression goes back to Jimmy Carter. There was an agreement made between Carter and an informal agreement between Carter and the dictator of Haiti, and Duvalier, to return refugees. That in violation of Article 14. That agreement was formalized under the Reagan administration, so there's a formal arrangement to illegally blockade Haiti and force the refugees back. That was continued under the Bush administration, but it did change. It changed in January 1991. What had happened was that Haiti had its first democratic election, and to everyone's surprise, a very lively and vibrant popular movement based in the hills and in the slums, which nobody had been paying attention to, succeeded in sweeping its own candidate into office, a populist priest, Jean-Bertrand Aristide. That was a very impressive demonstration of democracy in action. The United States was totally appalled. It had very confidently expected the victory of its own candidate, a former World Bank official who got 14% of the vote. The U.S. was instantly hostile and tried to undermine the regime. It terminated aid. It actually maintained aid, but it switched it to opponents of the government in the business community. It also changed the refugee policy. Up until that time, refugees had been forcibly returned. After the democratic regime was established, refugee flow slowed to a trickle. In fact, it actually reversed because people were returning to the country in a moment of hope. But the U.S. at that point began to accept asylum claims. In fact, at 50 times the previous rate during the democratic interlude. Well, things returned to normal 7 months later when there was a military coup that instituted huge terror with tacit support of the Bush and Clinton administrations, but it did also change refugee policy, moving it back into direct violation of Article 14 with another blockade forcing people back to terror. Well, that's Article 14. It's not the only example, but maybe the most dramatic one. Let's move on to Article 19. Article 19 says that everyone has the freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media. Well, there's no law that bars that in the United States, but the institutional structures very clearly do prevent it, and quite radically. So there's no law that bars me from saying now correctly that the United States has been one of the leading opponents, maybe the leading opponent, given its strength, of the three major pillars of the post-war order, the Bretton Woods system, the UN Charter, and the Universal Declaration. There's no law that prevents me from saying that the United States attacked South Vietnam under the Kennedy administration in 1961, then extended the war to all of Indochina, or there's no law that prevents me from doing what I just did, pointing out that the World Court condemned the U.S. for unlawful use of force in Nicaragua, and that the U.S. was carrying out a major terrorist war in the region, in large part a war against the church. There's nothing that prevents saying all these things, but they're not part of... to say that people have access to relevant information about that would be a joke. They certainly don't, either in the media or the schools or the universities or the journals of opinion, or for that matter in most of academic scholarship. That's institutional structure. It's not laws, which in effect undermine Article 19. Let me just take one example, which is current and rather dramatic and potentially of quite great significance. Has to do with the Multilateral Agreement on Investment, the MAI. You'll recall that last fall there was huge hubbub about fast track. There's a lot to say about that, but I'll put it aside. But one element of the fast track discussion was that almost certainly the MAI was a major factor entering into it. In fact, even before the fast track legislation had been introduced, the U.S. Council for International Business had demanded requested, I suppose is the word, of the Clinton administration that they include the MAI as a central element in fast track. And surely that was true. That's a lot more important than, say, bringing Chile into NAFTA or the kinds of things that were talked about. All of that was known, all of this has been known, but suppressed. Can't find anything about it in discussion. Why is that the case? The corporate world was enthusiastic, but it understood perfectly well that the public was opposed. It was not voted through, which is quite a victory for grassroots activism. The reason was explained by the Wall Street Journal during this period. It said that although they regarded fast track as what they called a no-brainer, it's so obvious that we should have it that you can't even discuss it, they said that critics have what they called an ultimate weapon, namely the public is opposed. It's kind of difficult to deal with that. The public is what Alexander Hamilton once called the great beast. And when the great beast gets out of its cage, you get into all kinds of trouble. Why should the public have been opposed to fast track, incidentally? Well, there was very little discussion of what it was all about, but people were instinctively opposed, and for good instincts. Contrary to what was being discussed, fast track didn't have anything to do with free trade. For one thing, because the agreements they had in mind aren't really free trade agreements. But for another, because the issue was not trade at all. The issue was democracy. The fast track legislation allows the president to negotiate trade agreements without any public knowledge or any public, or for that matter, congressional participation. Congress has simply offered the option, say yes or no, which means you say yes. The most ardent advocate of free trade would oppose fast track if they happen to believe in democracy, that if they happen to believe that the public has a right to know what's happening to them and have a voice in shaping policy. Well, all of that was suppressed. The major issue, the MAI, was suppressed. Again, all known, but suppressed for good reasons. You don't want the great beast to find out what's going on, and to serve as the ultimate weapon against what the serious people intend to push through. The free press in the United States and the intellectuals were super disciplined in violating Article 19. There was virtually nothing about it. Last November, 25 members of Congress sent a letter to the White House in which they said, it has come to our attention through the efforts of grassroots activists and public interest groups. They said it has come to our attention that for almost 3 years, the White House has been negotiating a very comprehensive trade agreement in secret, and they asked, how can this be possible, given that under the Constitution, international commerce is the province of the Congress, not the President, and furthermore, the terms of the treaty, which had been leaked, they had been illicitly obtained and leaked, the terms of the agreement endorse investor rights, corporate rights, that go far beyond the provisions of U.S. law. So how can this be going on? Well, they didn't get any real response. They got the sort of a vacuous letter a couple of months later. This was all known to the press, but unreported. However, there was a kind of response, and quite an interesting one. The White House made a public statement, the only one I know of, on the MAI. And in that statement, an Undersecretary of State and the trade representative assured their audience that the Clinton administration was fervently committed to the ideals of democracy, and it was making sure that, as they put it, the domestic constituencies that have a vital stake in this issue are informed and directly involved. And in fact, they said the U.S. is leading the way at the OECD in ensuring that this will be the case. This public statement, as far as I know, was never reported, but it's an interesting one. If you think it through, it tells you very clearly how the democratic process and the Universal Declaration are conceived by those in power. So who are the domestic constituencies who are directly involved and have a stake? Well, not Congress, because they weren't informed. Certainly not the public. They were kept out of it totally, thanks to the free press and its commitment to Article 19 of the UD. But there were domestic constituencies which were informed and intimately involved, like the U.S. Council for Business Operations. Well, you think it through, it's not a very hard job, you learn an important lesson, one that really ought to be taught in 8th grade civics and graduate departments of political science and so on. It's a lesson that's the powerful rarely express with such vulgar clarity their total contempt for democracy and their fear and hatred of the great beast. So it makes sense, makes good sense for all of this to be suppressed. Article 14 is just too dangerous to power to be allowed to survive. Article 19, the one that grants people the right of access to information through the media and so on. Well, it's kind of interesting and very interesting and an important lesson that despite the valiant efforts of the free press to keep the great beast uninformed, it nevertheless escaped the cage. Grassroots opposition became so powerful that the OECD, the rich countries, were forced to back down. The target date for the MAI was April 27th, and they couldn't sign, and they explained why. They said there's just too much opposition. That's quite a victory for grassroots opposition, grassroots organizing, confronting the most powerful concentration of power in the world, maybe that ever existed. The rich countries in the OECD, the transnational corporations, the international financial institutions, all strongly in favor of it. Free press completely backing it almost, with rare exceptions as in Canada. And nevertheless, they couldn't ram it through. The reaction has been interesting in the business press. So the Financial Times of London, which is, as I said, the major international business journal, they had an article bewailing this outcome. They said that hordes of vigilantes, I'm quoting it, hordes of vigilantes had overwhelmed the OECD and the corporate world using their organizational abilities and their strong finances and their influence with the media. I'm quoting all of this. In the US, the influence of the media was zero. It was barely above and elsewhere in the OECD. But the point is that even the slightest breach in total subordination is regarded as a catastrophe to the totalitarian mind. The article goes on to say that it'll be necessary to drum up business support to beat back the hordes. Now, just overwhelmed by the vigilantes. They then quote diplomats and World Trade Organization officials who fear, quoting, that it may no longer be possible to do deals behind closed doors and submit them for rubber stamping by Parliament, as in the good old days. The Australian that's important. Many people feel quite unjustly discouraged and gloomy about the opportunities to do things, but there have been really remarkable victories in the last couple of years, and this is one of the most dramatic of them. And the business world knows it, even if they won't tell you. The press in Australia blamed what they called the xenophobic hysteria of the unholy alliance of aid groups, labor, and environmentalists. A column, really bad news. In the New Republic, a columnist wailed about what he called the flat earth and black helicopter crowd that are on the loose, determined to find out what's being done to them by the serious guys who are used to doing deals behind closed doors and then having them rubber stamped. Well, that's important. The threat of democracy is quite real. And it's a major and encouraging victory for popular activism against very great odds. The game isn't over, of course. Class war is much too serious a matter to relinquish. But let's proceed to the universality of the Universal Declaration, of having dismissed Articles 13, 14, and 19 as inoperative by virtue of the extreme relativism of the United States with regard to the Universal Declaration. Well, these articles all fall within civil and political rights. That's the category that the U.S. considers privileged. I'll return to some more in that category if there's time. But first, let's have a look at the second category, the socio-political rights. Well, according to the principle of universality, these have the same status as the political and civil rights. But the leaders of the Western relativist challenge, they insist that the Universal Declaration must be modified in accord with their values, which assign no status to the socioeconomic principles. Jean Kirkpatrick once described them as a letter to Santa Claus, not to be taken seriously. Morris Abrams, who's the U.S. representative to the UN Commission on Human Rights, was a few years ago, he spelled that out in explaining Washington's opposition to a convention that was being considered the Convention on the Right to Development. Here's the definition of it: the right of individuals, groups, and peoples to participate in, contribute to, and enjoy economic, social, cultural, and political development in which all human rights can be fully realized. Morris Abrams pointed out that these are not rights. In fact, they're preposterous, he said. They're, in fact, a dangerous incitement. The error of the Convention on the Right to Development is that it endorses the principle that everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for health and well-being of himself and his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care and social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control. Notice that that's a virtual paraphrase of the right of development that's preposterous and a dangerous incitement. So therefore that must be preposterous, even a dangerous incitement, and we therefore abrogate Article 25 of the Universal Declaration, which I've just quoted. Notice that it includes the right to security, and in fact it's worker insecurity that is the key to the fairy tale, as the saintly Allen has explained. Well, the U.S. vetoed the Declaration on the Right to Development, effectively nullifying Article 25. I don't have to bother spending time on how well Article 25 is observed here. There are other elements involved in Article 25. The World Health Organization has pointed out that what it calls the devastation of hunger is clearly in violation of Article 25. It's transparent. They also pointed out that there are more deaths every 2 years from hunger than during both world wars. But that has no status from the relativist standard of the rich. In fact, the U.S. acts forthrightly to increase hunger. And that's the most striking example of that is the embargo against Cuba since 1962, which is the longest sanction in history and the only one that effectively bars food and medicine. That's a direct violation of Article 25. It's also a direct violation of a principle that the United States itself has introduced into at the Human Rights Commission. The U.S. At the Commission, the United States introduced a resolution declaring that the deliberate impeding of delivery of food and medical supplies to civilian populations is a violation of international humanitarian law, and those who commit it or order such acts are to be held individually responsible. That's fair and accurate. It's an accurate interpretation of international law, meaning people responsible for this should be brought before international tribunals. The reference is to Bosnia. But of course it applies very clearly to every president of the United States since the early 1960s. That, however, would be completely incomprehensible to Western relativists. Time's going on, and I won't have time to run through the rest, but if you run through the rest of the socioeconomic provisions, you discover that the respect for them is approximately comparable. The U.S. opposition to the Universal Declaration is so extreme and so deeply internalized among educated people that they simply can't comprehend when it's challenged. And that leads to some very strange results. For example, in the New York Times on Human Rights Day a couple of years ago, December 10th, the editors condemned the countries of Asia that, as they put it, reject the Universal Declaration and call instead for addressing the more basic needs for people, for food and shelter, medical aid, and schools. Yeah, exactly in conformity with the Universal Declaration. But so how can that be rejection? Well, the reasoning is very simple. The United States rejects these provisions, so therefore they're null and void, and by upholding them, the third world relativists are rejecting them. All it takes is a good education to understand all of this, and an intellectual class that is willing to subordinate itself to power to quite a remarkable extent. This came up again a little bit later in a more kind of philosophical discussion in the New York Times about the U.S.-China relations. The article contrasted the American emphasis on individual freedom with the Chinese insistence, I'm quoting it, the Chinese insistence that the common good transcends personal right. So China is calling for the right to food, clothing, shelter, education, the right to work, rest, reasonable payment, and it's criticizing the United States for not upholding these rights, which are all affirmed in the Universal Declaration, and incidentally are personal rights, but rights that the U.S. rejects. So the conclusion is this is kind of ironic or puzzling because the U.S. is the champion of the universality of the Universal Declaration, and somehow the Chinese are criticizing it. And the point is, it's easily understandable, China just doesn't understand the Western concept of human rights, which the relativist Western position led by the United States, China was insisting on the universality of the Universal Declaration, which the U.S. rejects. So that's all incomprehensible to properly educated people. Well, one of the crucial aspects of the Universal Declaration is a call for efforts to make sure that the rights described in words actually become law or become applicable. That's to be done by what are called enabling conventions that the United Nations will propose and that states will accept that implement particular aspects of the Universal Declaration. And there's a long series of these enabling conventions. For example, there's a Convention on Rights of the Child, 1989, which was accepted by most countries, not all, however. It was rejected by the United States and Somalia alone. There's an international covenant on civil and political rights. That was technically ratified by the United States, but with reservations. There was a reservation to Article 7, which states that no one shall be subject to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. The reason why the U.S. refused to accept that part is that conditions in U.S. prisons and other practices like the death penalty are even for children. The U.S. is virtually alone in allowing juveniles to be executed. I mean, Iran and Saudi Arabia and Pakistan do also. And U.S. prison practices have repeatedly been condemned, including by Human Rights Watch, as in violation of this article, and indeed in violation of Article 5 of the Universal Declaration, which prescribes cruel, inhuman, degrading punishment. Long studies by Human Rights Watch in this, so you'll have to look far to find them. I mean, unless you subscribe to Human Rights Watch publications. Well, the U.S. has, I think, the worst record in the industrial world, at least, maybe one of the worst in the world, in ratifying enabling conventions. And in fact, if you look closely, you find that it has effectively ratified none, because even though the few that have been ratified have been designated inapplicable in the United States. Technically, they're called non-self-executing. You can't apply them. That's radical violation of the Universal Declaration, which specifically calls for enabling conventions to turn the principles into practice. Well, that's just a tiny sample. I could go on for a long time. In fact, I have enough notes here to go on for another couple of hours. But the conclusions of the sample, I think, are pretty clear. They're clear about policy. They're clear about practices. They're clear about the intellectual culture that tolerates and supports them. The record is also clear about what can be done to modify and reverse these practices and crimes, and it's very much within our power to do so. Thanks. There's a kind of a reasonable way to proceed to figure out what the motives are. We can run through possibilities, see if some of them can be excluded. We can sort of narrow it down on some possibilities that are left. The one that immediately comes to mind, and the first one to pay attention to, is the one that is universally expressed and vociferously expressed and never questioned. Now, that's close to true. I mean, like maybe there's some statistical error and it's occasionally questioned, but you have to look hard to find it. That is, you hear it in high places, Tony Blair or Madeleine Albright, commentary, reporting, editorials. I'll just take one example because it's close to home, the Boston Globe. But this is completely typical, it's unfair to pick the Globe. The day of the latest bombings, there was an editorial called A Just Attack. And there was one reason for it, and it's a standard one. Saddam is a vengeful despot who has already used chemical and biological weapons on his own citizens, which is the ultimate horror. Now, obviously, such a creature has to be destroyed, poses an enormous threat, can't be tolerated, so you bomb him, you impose sanctions, and so on. That's essentially the universal view, the universal explanation. Unchallenged. The kind of instructive exercise would be to check to see to what extent there's been any question raised about that justification. Well, that justification does have at least one merit. It's very easily tested. It takes a minute to test it. You simply have to ask what was the U.S.-British reaction when Saddam Hussein carried out the ultimate horror, that is, used chemical weapons against his own people. He certainly did, no doubt that he's a monster. And he certainly carried out this act. He's a vengeful despot who has used chemical weapons against his own people. That's undoubtedly true, namely in 1988, when he carried out a major, several times, gassing campaign against Kurds. He also used nerve gas and chemical weapons and other chemical weapons and so on the war against Iran that was just finishing up at that time. And in fact, the use have increased till the end. So it happened, and there is a reaction on the part of the United States and Britain and the Boston Globe, and everybody else is talking about it, and you can see what that reaction is. It's on the record. Well, the reaction was that the United States and Britain increased their support for their favorite monster. They'd been supporting him avidly right through his worst crimes, and after the gassing, they increased the support. It's not a secret. You can easily discover it. So how did they increase the support? Well, in some interesting ways. The U.S. had been providing Iraq with all kinds of aid, but particularly at that point, they increased, the Reagan and later Bush administrations increased the subsidized food aid. Subsidized means, you guys are paying for it. Subsidized agricultural exports to Iraq. Now, why did, Iraq is an agricultural producer, had been a country, which one of the few countries in the region which was actually an efficient producer of food and even exporter. So what did it need agricultural exports for? Well, that was actually connected with the gassing of the Kurds. Saddam Hussein, the vengeful despot, was destroying agricultural areas and the people who lived in them. So therefore, there was actually a food shortage. And therefore, we had to come to the rescue to help out with this project of gassing Kurds in the north. And we did by increasing the subsidized agricultural exports to Iraq, essentially for that reason. At that time, this continued. So during the invasion of Panama, George Bush took off a moment to announce that we were going to increase this is December 1989, a year later, we're going to increase the credits to Iraq to allow them to purchase from U.S. agricultural and other producers. It wasn't just agricultural. I don't think this was reported in the press, nor, as far as I could discover, was it reported that one senator, Senator Inouye from Hawaii, thought this was kind of surprising and asked for clarification. And he was given an official clarification by the State Department, which again, I don't think was reported. He was told, official government policy, that we were going to increase our support for our favorite vengeful despot and mass murderer. They didn't say that. But we were going to increase the support to Saddam Hussein, that's the Globe, because, here it is, it would increase U.S. exports and put the United States in a better position to deal with Iraq on human rights issues. Okay. Well, there didn't have to be any laughter because it wasn't reported. But at that time, let's forget the small thing about increasing U.S. exports, meaning increasing the profits for agribusiness and the high technology industry and so on. At that time, the line was we are in a better position to deal with Iraqi human rights issues if we subsidize the monster. A year later, it turned out that we were in a better position to deal with human rights issues if we starve the Iraqi people into submission. Somehow you're not supposed to notice that the line changed for some reason, but whatever reason it changed for clearly had nothing to do with the ultimate horror, the using of chemical weapons against his own people, because that had already happened, and it just led us to increase the support. Okay, so put that in the back of our minds. In fact, this issue certainly has arisen. For example, Madeleine Albright, as perhaps you recall, was asked on national TV about a year or 2 years ago, I guess, She was asked on 60 Minutes what she thought about the fact that it was reported that about 500,000 Iraqi children had died as a result of the sanctions, which are putting us in a better position to deal with Iraqi human rights violations. And she said she agreed that this was a hard choice, but she said, we think the price is worth it. Okay, so that's the moral level of the way in which we deal with Iraqi human rights violations by killing 500,000 Iraqi children. We think the price is, we're willing to pay that price. That's nice to hear. The subsidies for our favorite killer when he was carrying out the ultimate horror were not restricted to subsidized agricultural exports. They also included technical equipment, dual-use equipment that could be used for military purposes, helicopters, for example, a lot of equipment which could even be used for production of chemical and biological warfare. This was all revealed afterwards. That went on. At the time, there was suspicion that Saddam Hussein had biological warfare facilities. The U.S. denied it, because he's our friend after all. He wouldn't do that sort of thing. But they were discovered by a very good journalist. He was at that time the Middle East reporter for ABC television, Charlie Glass. He was able to find high-level Iraqi defectors in London, general actually, and from information that he got from them, using French commercial satellites, which are low grade, but certainly nothing like what the Pentagon has. He was able to locate and identify biological warfare facilities. And ABC television let him run a spot on the news showing biological warfare facilities, giving the evidence from defecting Iraqi generals. Then they switched immediately to their Pentagon correspondent, who poo-pooed it, said, no, Pentagon says this is nonsense, forget about it, and the story died. Now, those same biological warfare facilities are being presented as proof that this reincarnation of Attila the Hun has to be destroyed by massacring his population. Same ones. And you're not supposed to remember that either. According to Iraqi dissidents, there has been for a long time a ban, an official ban, U.S. government ban against any contact with Iraqi dissidents, the democratic opposition. It's not because they're big radicals or anything like that. The head is a London banker, others are professionals. But there was a ban. And according to Iraqi dissidents, that ban was instituted forcefully right after the last gassing episode, so as not to irritate our friend Saddam Hussein. I can't vouch for that, but that the ban has been in operation is absolutely true. In fact, it's been reiterated repeatedly. After we got up to December 1989, January 1990, a few months after that, in April, a group of high-ranking U.S. senators went to Iraq. They met with Saddam in the Kurdish city of Mosul. Remember, the Kurds are the ones who are getting gassed. The delegation was headed by Robert Dole, who brought the president's greetings to Saddam. Alan Simpson, who I think is over at the Kennedy School now, he was in the delegation. He told Saddam that Saddam's problems are not with the American government, which has no objections to him. They are with some journalists, kind of loose cannons. And he advised Saddam that what he should do is invite them to Iraq so they could kind of see for themselves, be disabused of these notions. An Israeli scholar, a Middle East scholar, who's writing about this in retrospect, says accurately that the fawning before the dictator reminded him of Munich. That's a pretty good analogy. Well, that's up to April 1990. It's already 2 years after the Halabja massacre, the ultimate horror. And this carries us up to, this continues up until the day of the invasion of Kuwait. Okay, so that's when overwhelmingly Saddam Hussein's crimes were committed during that period. Some of the worst ones were committed afterwards. I'll come to that. But the major ones were committed up till that period, and the U.S. supported them all the way through. In fact, with a good deal of enthusiasm. So did Britain. That tells us something. It tells us that they cannot, just by elementary logic, the crimes can't be the reason why we have to destroy the monster. I mean, nothing could be more obvious than that. Well, what about the threat posed by Saddam Hussein? That's real. That threat peaked in the late 1980s, thanks to our support. That's the time when he was most threatening and most powerful. There's a measure of how great the threat was. That was he was then at war. He had attacked Iran with our support, and there was a war going on. He was unable to defeat Iran. That's a country which had just decimated its officer corps and top military at the time of the revolution, Khomeini revolution, the revolution which led to Khomeini. Even with the Iranian military largely decimated, Iraq was unable to defeat them with the support of the United States, Russia, Britain, Western Europe, and the Arab states. So that gives you a measure of the threat at its peak. But the U.S. Today, in comparison, Iraq is, as Charlie Glass again wrote in a recent article, the Iraqi army is approximately back to what it was when the British established it. Established it as a means to suppress the population violently so that the rulers would be able to export oil to the West and ensure that the profits go to the West, not to the people of the region. That's the role of most of the armies in the Middle East. And the Iraqi army is about back to that level. Its equipment is antiquated. It's far weaker than it was. A lot of the weapons have been destroyed, not so much by bombing, but by the inspection system, which has destroyed a lot of weapons, and of course by the destruction of the economy. So yes, it's a threat. It was a much greater threat 10 years ago. And how did the U.S. and Britain react to the threat at its peak? Well, I've already mentioned it, but the main reaction was to increase the threat. That was the reaction at the peak of the threat. And the U.S. took it very seriously. You want to remember how serious it was? Bear in mind that Iraq in May, I think, 1987, Iraqi missiles struck the U.S. destroyer Stark, killing 37 sailors, 37 personnel. And they got a kind of tap on the wrist, but that's it. That shows you're really committed to somebody. What was the U.S. Stark doing there? Well, the U.S. Navy at that time was being introduced into the Gulf to back up Iraq and support him in the war against Iran and, of course, in his war against his own population. That continued. That alliance strengthened. A year later, in July 1988, a U.S. warship, Vincennes, shot down an Iranian commercial airliner just taking off from Iranian airport. A commercial airliner killed 290 people, was plainly in a commercial check corridor. In fact, the ship was in Iranian territorial waters. That was taken seriously too. By that point, Iran recognized the reality. They might be able to fight a war with Iraq, but they could not fight an Iraqi-U.S. alliance. And with the U.S. Navy now acting aggressively, and the head of the U.S. claimed, it's not credible, that it's not taken very seriously, that it was mistaken for an Iranian military plane, but the Iranian Air Force pointed out right away that the U.S. was not shooting down low-flying Iraqi planes, which were very visible and indeed were warplanes. One of them even attacked the Star. Iran recognized at the time that the game is over. They can't, and they essentially capitulated shortly after that. Well, that's the peak of the Iraqi threat, thanks to our contribution. And Saddam, in fact, used his increased power very quickly. 5 days after the ceasefire, he turned to another major gas attack against Kurds in the north. 5 days after the ceasefire, the U.S. reaction I've already described. Okay. Well, just put this together, and we've now at least eliminated one candidate for what the motives were, namely the candidate that is universally presented without question and with great vigor and force. We know, as well as we know anything, that that one can't be correct, just on grounds of elementary logic. As I said, it's an instructive exercise you might try to see how often this little exercise in elementary logic has been carried out in the furor about, the Beast of Baghdad. So, for example, during the latest bombings, it's interesting. I think you already know the answer without looking, but it's worth finding out. And it raises questions about the world in which we live, most of us live, the world that's symbolized by Harvard Square, the world of thought thinking and, high minds and analysis and so on and so forth. You can think about it, and it's worth thinking about because it's significant. That has to do with what reaches the public, how it reaches the public. If this is being concealed, what does it tell you? All right, let's go on to that. There is an event that did change Saddam Hussein from favored friend to the Beast of Baghdad, namely August 2nd, 1990, when he invaded Kuwait. What about that? Is that why we have to impose the sanctions that are killing people and so on? Well, that's pretty hard to argue. For one thing, it's not in Kuwait. It's not very much offered, but that's clearly the major event. Was that a major crime? Sure, it's a war crime. Invading another country is a war crime. That's a thing for which people were hanged at Nuremberg and so on. On the other hand, was it a serious crime? Well, pretty hard to argue. In comparison with the rest of Saddam's criminal record, which we had supported, it's like adding a toothpick to a mountain. Furthermore, it was recognized by the United States not to be a very serious crime. In fact, the great fear of U.S. leaders at the time of the invasion, as Colin Powell put it, Chief of Staff, is that Iraq would quickly withdraw, leaving a puppet regime in place, and then all the Arab states would be happy. Colin Powell, virtual quote. That was the expectation. In fact, it was called the nightmare scenario. They were afraid it might happen. How much of a crime would that have been? Well, we can measure that too. If in fact the expectations of the U.S. leadership had been fulfilled, Saddam would have essentially duplicated what the United States had just done a couple of months ago in Panama. That is, invaded, put in a puppet government, and then withdrawn, leaving it in place. The puppet government happened to be a government of bankers and narco-traffickers and so on. But it was in place, and it's maintained essentially by U.S. force, but from a distance. So Saddam, the only real difference between the two cases is that Colin Powell may have been correct in saying that all the Arab states would have been happy, but it certainly wasn't true of Latin America. There was tremendous opposition to the U.S. invasion in Panama and elsewhere, and indeed that remains. Other than that, the analogy is pretty close. However, there's a crucial difference. In the case of Panama, the U.S. was able to veto two Security Council resolutions condemning it, vote against a General Assembly resolution, which effectively vetoes it. In the case of Iraq, however, the U.S., of course, the resolution stood. And subsequent events took place, which are worth going over, which I'll skip for lack of time. But what they essentially amounted to was U.S. efforts, with the strong cooperation of the media, to suppress the possibilities that this nightmare scenario might take place, and to ensure that the conflict would end in the arena of force and violence, where the U.S. is, of course, supreme. And that happened. It's an interesting story, but we'll put it out. Then we're up to February 1991, the Gulf Massacre. It ended at the end of the month, and shortly afterwards, within days, Saddam Hussein turned to the next most serious crimes of his career, the first most serious ones being the ones that the Boston Globe and everyone else is referring to, namely the chemical warfare against his own citizens, Immediately after the war, there was an uprising in southern Iraq, in the Shiite areas of the south, led by rebelling Iraqi generals. This is right under the nose of the U.S. Army, which dominated the whole region. Stormin' Norman is sitting there watching it, following orders from Washington. The rebelling generals did not ask for assistance. They asked for access to captured Iraqi equipment. That was supported by Saudi Arabia, who also requested the United States to allow them to have at least access to captured Iraqi equipment. The U.S. refused. It refused to do anything to deter the vicious Iraqi government response, which was brutal and murderous, even to let the rebels have access to equipment. The U.S. clearly wanted, and in fact had to say that it wanted the revolt to fail. And it failed. It was crushed with extreme violence. Right after that, a revolt began in the north, Kurdish areas, and the same story reenacted. The U.S. refused to act to give any assistance whatsoever to the rebels in fear that they might succeed, that is, they might overthrow the beast of Baghdad. Immediately after the war was over, the U.S. essentially returned to support for its favorite murderer, as he again carried out a really atrocious and vicious act, again, with our support. Well, that was kind of too visible to suppress at the time, so there was an official justification for it, and it remains until today. True, this offended our sensibilities and so on, but it was necessary in order to maintain something called stability. Stability is very important. You have to maintain stability. And in order to maintain stability, we had to keep the beast of Baghdad in power, even though he was carrying out huge massacres in the south and the north with our tacit support. The State Department line, as it was presented by its representative at the New York Times, that's the position called Chief Diplomatic Correspondent, was that what he said, the best of all worlds from the point of view of the United States, the best of all worlds would be an iron-fisted military junta that would rule Iraq just the way Saddam Hussein had done. But it would be nice if it didn't have Saddam Hussein's name on it, because that's kind of embarrassing. And he went on to say, as a Middle East expert, that this would be greatly to the satisfaction of our allies, Turkey and Saudi Arabia, which is probably true. He left out the most striking case because it's indelicate to mention it, but as he and every other reporter following the Middle East knew, it would be much to the pleasure of our ally Israel, which is the only country that I know of where there was open and public support across the spectrum for the crushing of the Kurdish rebellion, and of course the Southern Rebellion. That extended from the chief of staff all the way across to leading doves. And it was in the English press too, so nobody could have missed it. There was important articles in the Jerusalem Post, and they gave the reasons, which are understandable. The reasons were that an independent Kurdistan, an independent Kurdish state, would create a land corridor between Syria and Iran, which are their enemies. So they didn't want this, so therefore they wanted the U.S. to allow Saddam to crush the Kurds. I don't think that was ever reported here either. That was extremely prominent. It takes a decision and choice not to report it. This continues. A couple of years later, in 1996, Brent Scowcroft, who was Bush's national security advisor, was asked in an interview what he thought about this, and he said it would not necessarily have been to our interests to have Saddam Hussein overthrown because any replacement might have been worse. So therefore it was right to support Saddam while he carried out his second level, the second worst crimes of his career, namely crushing the southern and northern rebellions. And so it continues. Just yesterday, the general who heads the Central Command said essentially the same thing the day before. It was reported in yesterday's paper, General Zinni. And Madeleine Albright has chimed in too in an interesting way. In December, while saying that the U.S. had changed its policies, she said, Here's what she said last December. We have come to the determination that the Iraqi people would benefit if they had a government that really represented them. Well, you can guess whether this religious conversion is true or not, but if it is, we don't have to worry about it. What does it mean that in December 1998, the U.S. government had a revelation and decided it would be nice if the Iraqi people had a government that represented them instead of the beast of Baghdad who we've been supporting? Let's say she's true. Let's say her remark is true. What does it tell us? Okay, I won't comment on it. Furthermore, just to add to the story, during this very same period, early 90s, our favored ally, Turkey, one of the worst, which has one of the worst human rights records in the world, was increasing its own murderous attack against the Kurds in southeastern Turkey. From just as one measure of that, about 1 million Kurds fled to Diyarbakir, the sort of unofficial Kurdish capital in southeastern Turkey, during those years. 1994 was a peak year in two respects. It was the year in which Turkish terror against the Kurds peaked, and it was the year in which U.S. military aid to Turkey peaked. In fact, in that year, Turkey became the world's leading importer of U.S. arms. Those are two things that typically go along together. There's a very close correlation between terror and violence and U.S. military aid, not only in that region. Well, somehow that didn't mean that we had to impose sanctions on the people of Turkey to kill hundreds of thousands of their children, because this is good terror. It's terror carried out by our ally at the same years. Well, without proceeding, it's plain that there cannot have been any moral or humanitarian motive behind anything that's going on, and it certainly cannot possibly have been the official motives, the ones that are reported by, say, the Boston Globe editors. It cannot be Saddam's crimes that are motivating this. That, again, is just elementary logic. What about the threat of weapons of mass destruction? Well, that's there's a number of problems. Suppose we're concerned about weapons of mass destruction. Then one question, obviously, is how come it wasn't true in 1988, when it was a much more serious threat than it is today? It's a little question. Second question is, the latest bombings, for example, are part of the justification is that they were supposed to reduce Saddam's capacity to produce weapons of mass destruction, but it was conceded at once, in advance, in fact, that the bombings would have the opposite effect. They would increase that capacity. That was conceded because it was obvious. The major effect of the bombing would be to eliminate UNSCOM, the UNSCOM inspections. In fact, at least if you can believe Scott Ritter, one of the chief inspectors who resigned from UNSCOM about a year ago. The U.S. had already undermined UNSCOM by turning it into a spy agency, which essentially destroyed it, he said, so I quit. But whether he's right or not about that, probably is, in December, the bombing was understood in advance and stated that, yes, this will eliminate and make it extremely hard for UNSCOM to continue its mission. And the inspection mission regime is the only thing that has cut back weapons. And it's been pretty successful, in fact, quite successful, and could remain so. But, of course, once that's broken, it's not going to happen. In fact, if you look at the official war aims last December, they made it pretty clear. They said the official aim is to degrade Saddam's weapons capacity. And as a number of people noticed, that means they had no war aim at all. Because, you shoot one bullet at a door and you degrade the capacity. It's meaningless. There were no credible war aims. In fact, the effect of the bombing could only be to increase the alleged danger. Probably will be that. But what's interesting is it doesn't matter. I mean, the fact that there are no credible war aims and that the standard reason doesn't even rise to the level of a joke doesn't matter at all. It's still a just attack, and we must march in a parade, right? In other words, we must act as if we're in a totalitarian society, following orders marching in a parade, even though we recognize that the marching orders are idiotic and would collapse under 30 seconds of inquiry, and that the motive for this last attack is that, that the effect of it will be the opposite of what's claimed. Despite knowing all of that, we must march in a parade. If you're an educated, responsible citizen, kind of folks who walk around places like this, that's the way you're supposed to behave. Well, it tells us something about the expectations for us and about the values that are internalized by educated people, because they're not getting orders to do this; they just do it naturally. Going back to weapons of mass destruction, there is indeed a way to eliminate the capability of producing one and only one way, and that is a Carthaginian solution. You totally destroy the society. You do that, they won't be able to produce weapons of mass destruction. If you leave an infrastructure, you leave educational and scientific facilities of any kind, and if there's a revenue flow, then you get a capacity to produce weapons of mass destruction. So the only way to end that capability, we talk about terminating it. Yeah, there is a way. Wipe the place out. Now that won't happen for a simple reason. Iraq is the second largest oil producer in the world, and that's much too valuable to wipe out. But of course you can wipe out its population. In fact, it's in a way beneficial to do that. You look at the history of oil production around the world, you find that it mostly takes place, the focus on, and what's prized is areas where there aren't very many people. A lot of oil, but not too many people. Because then there's no pressure or little pressure to stop the profits from going to the people who really should have them, Western oil companies, the U.S. Treasury, and so on. So if the population of Iraq were reduced or marginalized somehow, maybe reduced to such a level, maybe not murdered, but reduced to such a level that they're barely functional, then when the time comes to bring Iraqi production back onto line, as it will, there'll be less of an impediment. It'll be more like, say, Saudi Arabia, where there's a lot of oil but no people around pressing for economic development and educational facilities and so on and so forth. So that's kind of all to the good. There is a way then to eliminate the capability, and it's the only way. Other than that, it can't be done. Well, without proceeding further, it seems to me we can eliminate the standard reasons from consideration. They cannot be the reasons and the motive for what's going on pretty elementary grounds. In fact, if we begin to explore, we find a rather ugly story. What is left? What is left is what should come to mind at once when anybody mentions the word Middle East. When you mention that word, what comes to mind is oil. Right? It should come to mind. Back in the 1940s, the United States recognized that region, the Arabian Peninsula and the Persian Gulf, to be what they called a stupendous source of strategic power, the greatest material prize in world history, the strategically most important area in the world, and just kind of going off into outer space. And of course that meant the U.S. has to control it. That meant kicking out our rivals, France, and marginalizing Britain. They're allowed to play a secondary role as long as they're properly obedient, kind of loyal attack dog. But essentially the U.S. is going to control it. You don't give up the greatest material prize in world history and a stupendous source of strategic power. So the U.S. has to control it. Well, that's a problem because there are people in the region and they get out of hand, and sometimes they want to benefit from their own resources and so on. So there's constant conflicts. This issue is very serious right now. Right now, at the moment, there's an oil glut. You go to the gas station and the prices are lower in real terms than they've been since the Second World War, and the oil price is low. And so that's one reason why it's beneficial to the United States to keep Iraqi oil off the market. The United States does not want the oil price to go too low. It's always wanted it to stay within a range. not too high because that would be harmful to U.S. manufacturers and so on, but not too low because that's harmful to the U.S.-based, to the energy producers, which are mostly U.S.-based, either U.S. or British mainly. And their profits go down. And furthermore, the petrodollars, the money that's gotten from selling oil a lot of it flows right back here. U.S. Treasury securities, big construction projects, military production, and so on. And that flow has to be maintained. So you don't want the oil price to go too low. Temporarily, at least, it's a good idea to keep Iraqi oil off the market, because if it went on, the price would go even lower, and that's not good. The other problem with Iraqi oil is that the inside track right now on developing Iraqi oil is held by France and Russia, not by U.S.-based majors. We don't want that. So, right for the moment at least, keeping Iraqi oil from being developed is a wise, from some point of view, wise project. Is this going to last? Well, not if the consensus of geologists is correct. Details are always uncertain, especially in the case of oil production, because most of the information is in the hands of the oil companies who aren't telling anybody. But there's a pretty reasonable consensus that this is temporary, that sometime in the not-too-distant future there'll be an oil crisis. The rate of discovery, which increased from mid-19th century steadily, peaked around 1965. It's been declining ever since. That is, with new high technology and deep drilling and everything else. Still, the rate of discovery has been declining. The rate of oil use, on the other hand, has been increasing. After the so-called crisis in 1973, when the prices shot up, from that period until today, almost half of the total oil consumption in history has been since that time. That's the last 25 years, and it's going up. It's expected that there's kind of like a magic 50% mark where you've used up 50% of the exploitable oil. That's expected to come not too far in the future. And if you extend these trend lines, you can see what's happening. Maybe a decade or a couple of decades. I mean, people disagree about the date, but not qualitatively. Furthermore, most of the remaining oil's in the Middle East. The percentage of exploitable oil in the Middle East is increasing. The other regions that, like Alaska and the North Sea, were always known to be quite small by comparison, and they're kind of reaching exhaustion. The Middle East will remain as the major center, primarily Saudi Arabia, secondarily Iraq, and unless there's something that nobody knows about, that'll continue. That means that control over this region is going to be extremely important. If James Akins, who's an old oil hand who was the former U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia, recently said, as only a semi-joke, that when the price per barrel of oil gets up to $30, you'll see that Saddam Hussein will turn into Mother Teresa. That sort of captures the point, I think. But of course, only if U.S.-based majors get first pickings on it. Certainly not if the Iraqi people do. It's a region of a lot of complex crises and conflicts, many of them related to just this fact. People in the region have never accepted the fact that the profits from their sole resource should go to the West, and that leads to all sorts of problems. To maintain control, it's been necessary to have brutal regimes around which will suppress their own populations. Well, the family dictatorships in the Gulf are too weak to do that. They have to be kept weak, so they'll do what they're told, but they don't have the force to really repress population. So there's always been what Nixon's Secretary of Defense called cops on the beat, local police force of tough guys around the region who keep order. And they're preferably non-Arab, because they do better shooting Arabs, apparently. There's been such an alliance. That was the main role of Iran, as long as it was under the Shah. That's why the U.S. supported him so strongly. It's been the main role of Israel, particularly since 1967. Turkey is another major one. Pakistan has been another. This ring of non-Arab states are supposed to keep order. Right now, there's a lot of conflict now. But, you have to bear in mind that the U.S. is isolated. The U.S. and Britain are isolated now internationally and regionally, not only on the issue of Iraq, but also on the issue of Iran. The U.S. is very isolated on that. That's the background for the conflicts that are going on about a pipeline from the Caspian region. Most of the producers, and in fact even the oil companies, want to have a pipeline through Iran, which is the most secure and the cheapest and the most stable area and so on. The U.S. is refusing. It's insisting that the pipeline go through Turkey. They also wanted to cut out Russia. And there's a lot of conflict over this. The Caspian region is, it's not like the Middle East. It's a substantial oil resource, but nobody thinks it's on a par with the Arabian Peninsula and the Gulf. It's another secondary source, but still there's plenty of money to be made there. And there's a conflict between the United States and Europe, the United States and Russia, the United States and China. There's a lot of conflict about how the profits are going to be shared among that, and the pipeline is part of it. The United States is trying to keep Iran out, even in opposition to the U.S.-based oil companies in this case, which is not a unique case, but a little unusual. How's the United States going to handle this? How's it going to run the region in the face of these conflicts and oppositions? Well, if you're involved in any kind of conflict, whether it's a card game or anything else, you try to play your strong hand. You try to shift things around so that they'll be in the arena in which you're strong. The U.S. has comparative advantage in exactly one area, force and violence, not anywhere else. In force and violence, it is unparalleled. Nobody comes close. So it makes good sense for planners to try to play that hand, shift everything into that arena, and that, I think, is exactly what we're seeing. I think that's what we saw when the U.S. bombed Sudan, for example, destroying its major pharmaceutical plant. It's interesting to notice how little attention was given to that in the United States. I mean, if there had been an Islamic terrorist attack that destroyed half of U.S. pharmaceutical facilities, you'd think somebody might have noticed. But this one, it's just Africa, who cares? So we attack a pharmaceutical plant. Let's get on to the next thing, like, whether Monica Lewinsky, something or other. But I think that message was understood by the people to whom it was likely sent, namely people in Tehran and Riyadh, Saudi Arabia and Iran. They're saying, look, we're a violent, lawless state, and we're going to use force to get what we want. I think that's probably the prime reason for the December bombings, too. The one thing where we have overwhelming advantage is in force. And it doesn't matter if the excuses are not credible. It doesn't matter if the effect of the bombing is the opposite of what we claim we're after. We can count on educated Americans to march in a parade and not say anything. And we'll show you'll understand, but we'll show you that what we say goes. George Bush's definition of the New World Order while the missiles were dropping in February 1991. I think that's the message, and that's understood. We're a violent, lawless state. Get out of the way, or else. That's, I think, accurate. I think that also accounts for the very clear and open contempt for international law. That's been pretty dramatic in this case. Not that it's anything new, but it's the flaunting of it is kind of dramatic. So there's just no doubt in the world at all that just to pick a minor incident, the bombing of Iraq or the bombing of Sudan, which are minor in context, that those were flat, outright violations of the UN Charter. In other words, more war crimes. That was understood. So it was condemned by the Vatican as aggression. It was the Arab world was condemned as aggression all over the place. In India, the International Council of Jurists in India, the major lawyers group, is actually bringing a case to the World Court charging Clinton and Blair with war crimes. That was December 22nd. I had a friend do a database search to see if he could find any reference to it. When he looked a couple of weeks ago, there still was no reference to it. But this, and the Pope, I think, got a word somewhere. But the point is, that this is aggression, a war crime is pretty clear and obvious. But that's what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be violent, lawless acts. It's kind of striking that the issue of whether this violated the UN Charter was barely discussed here. It was discussed to some extent in England, but barely, and in fact condemned in England in the mainstream, but not here. Here there's much more discipline. When the issue was mentioned at all, which was rare, it was dismissed as a kind of technicality. That's important. It's getting late and I won't go through the record, but there's an interesting record of explicit doctrine saying that we are not subject to international law. During the Reagan years, this became quite open. So, when the bombing of Libya, maybe the most striking case was the International Court of Justice, when it condemned the United States for the war against Nicaragua. It was just dismissed across the board, joke. And the internal reasons were interesting. The State Department had a legal analysis of why International Court of Justice was irrelevant. And the reason was that we cannot count on members of the United Nations to follow our opinion. That's exactly what they said. And therefore, the International Court of Justice is ruled out as an inappropriate forum. They said the United States will determine, will have to make its own determination of how to deal with issues that affect its interests. Okay? The issue at that time was what it calls issues that fall within our domestic jurisdiction. The issue that fell within our domestic jurisdiction then was the U.S. terror war against Nicaragua. Since the outside world can't be trusted to take the right position on this, you get lost. In the Clinton years, this has become totally open. So, Madeleine Albright, when she was UN ambassador, simply told the UN, we will act multilaterally when we can, unilaterally if we must. You don't like it, get lost. That was over an Iraq case. In December, the official line was that, quoting it, we prefer to act through our allies, but if not, we will act alone. If we're unable to, we'll act alone. There's an interesting formulation. It goes a step further. Notice we don't even prefer to act through the United Nations. That's finished. Happens that international law and the UN Charter say that's the way you do it, but that's finished. Same reason, we can't count on them anymore, so they're irrelevant. We prefer to act through our allies, who are usually more or less malleable, but if we can't act through them, we'll act alone. The timing of the bombing was selected in order to make this very plain. Recall that the bombing began just as the UN, an emergency meeting of the Security Council was being called to deal with the issue of Iraq. The members of the Security Council weren't notified, but as the meeting opened, the missiles were flying. They understood. That's a message of contempt for the United Nations, saying, you better understand you're irrelevant. You don't come along with it, you don't follow us anymore the way you used to when we sort of held a lash, so you're therefore out of it. And it was understood. A senior European diplomat pointed out that at the time that the United States has simply given up on the United Nations and prefers to act through NATO and the World Trade Organization, at least as long as they're reliable. Sometimes they aren't, so you throw them out too. Well, you know, the world should take notice, and it does. Outside of privileged circles, certain narrow privileged circles and powerful circles, it's pretty well understood. We should take notice too. It's quite important for us if we have to decide whether that's the national persona that we want to project. Of course, for a rogue state, things like international law and UN Charter and so on don't mean anything. And especially a rogue state that's violent and lawless and is projecting that as its persona, yeah, sure, they don't mean anything. And that gains particular significance when that rogue state happens to be the most powerful state in the world. Well, you know, if that's the national persona we want, okay. But it's, I think, important to recognize the dedication of the educational and information systems, you know, media, et cetera, to suppress the obvious. I think this is fairly obvious. Unless that's reversed, I think you can be pretty confident that there are ugly times ahead, particularly if in the Middle East, especially if the anticipated oil crisis becomes reality. Well, the answer to how seriously we take that depends not on what happens in this room, but what happens in the small groups that will be set up afterwards. That's where the important things will happen, and I really would urge you to participate in this.
Major corporations which are parts of even bigger conglomerates. Now, like any other corporation, they have a product which they sell to a market. The market is advertisers, that is, other businesses. What keeps the media functioning is not the audience. They make money from their advertisers. And remember, we're talking about the elite media, so they're trying to sell a good product, a product which raises advertising rates. And ask your friends in the advertising industry, that means that they want to adjust their audience to the more elite and affluent audience. That raises advertising rates. So what you have is institutions, corporations, big corporations, that are selling relatively privileged audiences to other businesses. Well, what point of view would you expect to come out of this? I mean, without any further assumptions, what you'd predict is that what comes out is a picture of the world, a perception of the world, that satisfies the needs and the interests and the perceptions of the sellers, the buyers, and the product. Now, there are many other factors that press in the same direction. If people try to enter the system who don't have that point of view, they're likely to be excluded somewhere along the way. After all, no institution is going to happily design a mechanism to self-destruct. It's not the way institutions function. So they all work to exclude or marginalize or eliminate dissenting voices or alternative perspectives and so on because they're dysfunctional. They're dysfunctional to the institution itself.